Samina Imam's journey began in 1980 in the UK, nurtured by her devoted father, Imam Dean, and a mother whose name remains cherished by the family. Her Pakistani heritage was a vibrant thread that enriched her life with traditions and values. Samina's youth flourished at Loxford High School, where she graduated in 1998 as a bright and ambitious young woman. Now 34, she found herself in Coventry, working as a marketing manager at Costco. Though details of her personal life were limited, her presence was highly valued, bringing joy to her family and colleagues. In 2014, amidst the busy aisles of Costco, Samina met Roger Cooper, a 41-year-old warehouse manager with 2 decades of logistics experience who had spent his entire career at the same store. This encounter marked the start of a new chapter for Samina, filled with the promise of new beginnings. Everything seemed to be aligning perfectly for her, with days filled with ease and happiness. However, on Christmas Eve in 2014, an unexpected event shattered her world. As Samina eagerly anticipated her date with Roger that Christmas Eve, she had also arranged to visit her family, particularly to spend time with her ailing mother after the holiday celebrations. Roger promised to celebrate the holidays with her, prompting Samina to book an extravagant 2-night stay at the Malmaison Hotel in Birmingham. With £500 paid, she meticulously organized for meals to be served in their room, setting the scene for what was meant to be a romantic Christmas celebration. As the clock struck 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Samina wrapped up her shift at the store. Little did she know that the journey ahead would deviate from the plans she had envisioned. After a brief stop at a liquor store to get a bottle of champagne, she began on her fateful drive toward the Malmaison Hotel. On her way there, she had a final conversation with her sister, during which she inquired about their mother's health. Samina assured her sister that she would be arriving at their parents' home on Boxing Day, December 26, 2014, eager to partake in the family's Christmas celebrations in Essex. This conversation underscored Simeon's commitment to her family and her eagerness to be with them during the festive season. However, her unexplained disappearance following this conversation left her family deeply concerned. What was more concerning was the fact that Simeon even texted her friends wishing them a Merry Christmas, but then suddenly ceased to reply. The abrupt halt in communication, coupled with Simeon's failure to fulfill her planned visit, added to the distress surrounding her disappearance. This led to the police being alerted by Samina's family on December 26, 2014. The investigative saga commenced swiftly, and authorities were trying to do everything to get to the bottom of this crime. Media outlets, both local and social, rallied the community, amplifying the search efforts to locate her. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. A missing persons report was filed, prompting authorities to step in and join the search. The police talked to Samina's co-workers at the Costco in Coventry, who provided a crucial detail. One retail worker informed police that he last saw her departing the store around 4 p.m. on December 24th. It was the last time she was ever seen alive. Surveillance footage provided glimpses into Simeon's last known movements, leaving her workplace, purchasing champagne, and departing in her car. Despite these visual clues, her precise location remained elusive. The West Midlands Police Department turned to cell tower data, using it to approximate Simeona's whereabouts. On December 30, 2014, investigators traced Simeona's movements to Leicester, precisely to the residence of David Cooper, Roger's brother, on Christmas Eve at 5 p.m. At the same time, Roger's phone records showed that he was also in the area. It seemed unlikely that it was a coincidence they were both there at the exact same time, raising questions about why they were there together. As the investigation got more complicated, they wanted to know who Samina was going to meet on Christmas Eve. Their attention zeroed in on Roger Cooper, the person she was supposed to spend the evening and the next night with. Roger Cooper was brought in for questioning on January 1, 2015. Now he was the main person the investigators were looking at closely. While they were questioning Roger for details, a new piece of information emerged. Remember how Samina's last mobile signal led to David Cooper's location? investigators considered interviewing David Cooper at the same time. While probing David Cooper's possible involvement, the investigators couldn't ignore a nagging question. If Samina and Roger had already booked hotel rooms, why were they at David's house? This added layer of mystery intensified the suspicions surrounding the case. Before diving deeper into the story, understanding the Cooper brothers' backgrounds becomes important. Their lives and connections might be essential in understanding the mystery surrounding Samina's case. Let's start with Simeon's Christmas Eve date, Roger Cooper. He was born in Leicester around 1973 and excelled as a manager at the Birmingham Costco warehouse. He was admired for his leadership. However, beyond this public role, Roger led a secretive life known only to a few, juggling multiple affairs, including one with Samina Imam and another unnamed Costco employee. He maintained a long-term relationship with his partner, Mira Chavda. Shockingly, Samina was unaware of his long-term commitment. This hidden reality exposed a more complicated and problematic side to Roger than anyone had realized. Roger's carefully constructed facade began to crumble when Simeon discovered the shocking truth. Learning through a coworker about Roger's other relationships shattered her trust as it revealed a web of deceit and hidden liaisons. Now turning our attention to Roger's brother, 39-year-old David Cooper, he added a surprising twist to the unfolding mystery. David, a former soldier, managed a cafe and worked as a doorman. Intriguingly, Simeon's last cell phone signal led investigators to David's address in Leicester. The bond between Roger and David extended beyond family. They shared a close-knit relationship. The brothers shared a mutual love for Star Wars, often using cryptic phrases from the movies to communicate with each other, either referring to the lore of the movies or events from their daily lives. That being said, it's here that the real puzzle surfaces. Did David share any connection with her? These questions loomed large over the investigation, casting a shadow of uncertainty over the ties between Samina, Roger, and now his brother David. Let's look at the dynamics of Samina Imam and Roger Cooper's relationship. Was it genuine, or was Roger merely using her? At first glance, Roger and Samina appeared to be just another couple, sharing laughter, secrets, and what seemed like genuine affection. Their connection was filled with playful banter and affectionate moments, a facade hiding the grim reality beneath the surface. Little did Samina know that she was just another woman in Roger's life. Despite his long-term commitment to his partner, Mira, Roger found comfort in clandestine moments with Samina. At least, that's what Samina was made to believe. Initially, she didn't know that he was having a third relationship with another woman in the same store. Their relationship was shrouded in secrecy due to strict company policies against workplace relationships. Yet their bond grew stronger, blurring the lines between right and wrong, until Samina found herself hopelessly entangled. She saw a future with Roger, a peaceful life together, but there was a catch. He was already entangled in multiple relationships. Despite the red flags, Samina clung to the hope that Roger would leave his family for her. As their relationship deepened, Samina's desperation for a settled life intensified. She confronted Roger, issuing an ultimatum towards the end of 2014: divorce his wife or lose her forever. The facade of their perfect relationship shattered when Samina discovered Roger's infidelity, another lover hidden in the shadows of their workplace. Enraged and betrayed, she threatened to expose their affair to his wife and their employer. Roger, adept at manipulation, managed to soothe Samina's anger, convincing her of his loyalty and promising to file for divorce after the holidays. He also said they'd go away on Christmas Eve for 2 nights. It was at the very beginning of this ill-fated trip that Samina disappeared. Now diving into the investigation, the police had their sights set firmly on Roger Cooper and were also wondering about the involvement of his brother David. On January 4th, 2015, Samina's car was found in Luton, about 65 miles away from Coventry. Her handbags, suitcases, and items she brought were missing. The lack of fingerprints made investigators suspicious, but there was another interesting detail. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone taller than Samina, possibly over 6 feet. This suggested that someone else used the car after her shopping trip. Additional evidence that the police found that pointed their suspicions towards the brothers involved multiple automatic number plate recognition hits tracking their vehicles between Coventry and Leicester. A Bellini bottle, purchased by Miss Imam on Christmas Eve in Coventry, was discovered in David's home fridge. While Roger was Samina's date, the presence of the bottle in David's house raises the question: how did the bottle end up at David's house? These details added complexity to the investigation. During the investigation, the brothers, David and Roger, firmly denied any involvement in the crime, but their text messages told a different story. He used cryptic phrases from the movies to communicate secretly. Phrases like Death Star complete, stay on target, and you are expected, Vader hinted at a hidden plan. One particularly puzzling French message roughly translates to there's no point, no score. The window of opportunity is closed, which caught attention. The message hinted at a closed opportunity or a mischance. The detectives interpreted their Star Wars messages as alluding to Miss Imam's abduction and murder. While the majority of their exchanges appeared to center around Star Wars, another concerning detail caught attention: David Cooper's eBay purchase history. He had recently purchased chloroform, a substance well known for use to knock people out, but which also can be lethal in larger doses. When coupled with Samina's missing car and the various intriguing details, the plot thickened. After all the clues and circumstantial evidence pointed towards the Cooper brothers, they were arrested on suspicion of murder on January 7, 2014 and brought in for questioning. During the interrogation of the Cooper brothers, subtle yet crucial disparities began to emerge in their narratives. Roger Cooper presented a detailed and emotionally charged account of his last encounter with Samina, a level of detail and emotion that the police found excessive. Recognizing David Cooper as the more vulnerable of the two, investigators intensified their pressure on him. This strategic approach, when applied effectively, can yield significant results, particularly when the person under scrutiny remains unaware of their alleged accomplice's statement. While he initially did try to mislead them, eventually, the police learned what actually happened on that fateful Christmas Eve. Samina had set off with Roger, believing they were headed to the Malmaison Hotel in Birmingham. Without Samina's knowledge, Roger was secretly directing their journey away from Birmingham, heading instead to a hidden location in Leicester, Roger's brother David Cooper's residence. As they arrived at David's house at Hughenden Drive around 5 p.m. on December 24th, Samina, unaware of her upcoming tragedy, greeted Roger's brother with genuine warmth. In a sudden and terrifying move, David and Roger launched themselves at Samina. The attack was horrifying. Samina's legs trembled, fear gripping her as she pleaded for help. She fought back, struggling against them. But David, with a cloth soaked in chloroform, covered her mouth and nose, silencing her cries until she couldn't breathe anymore. She faded away around 6:25 p.m., her efforts in vain against the overwhelming force. After the heinous act, Roger heartlessly headed back to Coventry, planning to spend Christmas Eve with his unsuspecting family. He left her body and her car with David, but it would take detectives some more time to figure out exactly what he had done with them. But David astonishingly confessed to assisting his brother in the horrendous act of killing Samina. The detectives learned that Samina tragically passed away due to chloroform toxicity. Investigators discovered compelling evidence in David's eBay purchase history, indicating a purchase of 200 milliliters of chloroform for £12, which he alleged never arrived. Further inquiries revealed David's movements, retrieving Samina's BMW from Coventry on Boxing Day and later abandoning it in Luton. He meticulously wiped away any fingerprints and DNA from the vehicle using a cleaning agent, methodically covering his tracks. Later, he also reveals how he tried to hide Samina's lifeless body, the callous act of killing someone and then referring to them as this thing speaks volumes about the perpetrator's lack of empathy and respect for human life. Such an act speaks to a disturbing level of dehumanization where the victim was stripped of their individuality and reduced to a mere object. This detached and callous language suggests that the act of killing was not just devoid of remorse, but potentially motivated by a deep-seated hatred or an animosity towards the victim. The dehumanizing language serves to further distance the perpetrator from the gravity of their actions, making it easier for them to justify and rationalize their behavior. David's continued refusal to disclose the location of Simeon's body cast a long shadow of suspicion over him. His fabricated stories about others taking the body away only raise further questions. The fabricated stories appear to be a desperate attempt to distance himself from the crime and deflect suspicion. Such behavior is characteristic of individuals who have something to hide, further fueling the flames of doubt surrounding their innocence. While David initially misled the authorities about Simeon's whereabouts, a crucial piece of evidence emerged that ultimately led to the discovery of the truth. A friend of David's, prompted by his arrest, came forward and revealed that David had entrusted him with a set of keys, including one that belonged to an allotment he owned in Leicester. The police, acting swiftly on this information, descended upon the allotment, carrying the weight of hope and determination. On January 16, 2015, the long-held silence surrounding Simeon's disappearance was shattered, leaving hearts broken. Upon arrival at David's allotment, an unsettling sight greeted them. A sheet of tarpaulin lay crumpled on the ground, with a suspicious mound of earth beneath it. Footprints, fresh and clear, marked the surrounding area. As they carefully excavated the soil, the grim reality unfolded. Samina Imam's body was found in Leicester, owned by David Cooper, a seemingly ordinary structure now at the center of a disturbing discovery. The haphazard manner in which the body was concealed spoke volumes about the perpetrator's state of mind. It was a stark contrast to the meticulous planning seemingly evident in the earliest stages of the crime. The haste and lack of proper concealment suggested that their focus was solely on the act itself, with little thought given to evading detection or ensuring a successful cover-up. This botched attempt ultimately led to their undoing and exposed the truth to the light of justice. Most disturbingly, Samina's body was found wrapped in cling film and a sleeping bag that belonged to David Cooper, serving as concrete evidence of his involvement in this tragic crime. Adding to the grimness was a sign hanging on the shed, its message blunt: "Don't wind me up. I'm running out of places to hide the bodies." The West Midlands police investigation was determined and thorough. They followed every lead carefully, leaving no stone unturned, and pieced together the events leading to Samina's tragic end. What made this ordeal particularly unsettling wasn't only the discovery of Samina's remains. The sign, meant as a joke, became a chilling confession, revealing the darkness lurking beneath ordinary surfaces. It was as if the perpetrator was challenging the law enforcement itself. Post-mortem examinations confirmed that the Cardiff-based shop worker met her demise due to chloroform. Additionally, a peculiar mix of metallic elements, antimony, cadmium, tin, mercury, and arsenic, was likely administered to Samina Imam in a liquid form. During the 8-week trial, the chilling truth emerged. Roger Cooper carefully planned to silence Samina Imam for months, fearing she would expose their affair. The brothers, 41-year-old Roger and 39-year-old David Cooper, remained composed during their trial, avoiding eye contact as the jury unanimously convicted them at Birmingham Crown Court. Later, on October 20, 2015, during the trial, Roger made a shocking admission, revealing that a seemingly puzzling message, "You are expected, Vader," was actually a coded reference to Miss Imam. He claimed it was part of a surveillance effort to determine if she was involved with someone else. But the truth was the brothers' first attempt to harm Samina Imam took place way before in December at Soil Hill Premier Inn. Samina was a regular guest and planned to spend the night there following a Christmas party. Under the guise of a surprise, Roger had instructed Samina to meet him at the hotel, claiming to have booked a room for them. However, the surprise was a lie. No room had been booked, and Roger wasn't planning to be there. Meanwhile, David, Roger's brother, lurked in a rented car parked in the hotel's car park, prepared to abduct Samina. To communicate their plan, the brothers relied on cryptic messages coded in Star Wars references, like Death Star complete and stay on target. Stay on target. You are expected, Vader. However, on that day, the taxi stopped right at the entrance, which didn't give David a chance to get close to Samina. The plan failed, and Samina safely entered the hotel. Frustrated, David sent a message to his brother in broken French, which translated to "There's no point, no score. The window of opportunity is closed." Simeon, just 34 and one of Roger's lovers, was later overpowered on Christmas Eve of 2014 at David Cooper's home, meeting a tragic death by chloroform. Despite their calm facade and planning, justice caught up with the brothers. Arrested under suspicion a week before Samina's body was discovered, they couldn't escape the truth uncovered by post-mortem tests. Their arrest and subsequent conviction by Judge Thomas on October 21, 2015 led to a life sentence for each, with a minimum of 30 years of prison time. While sentencing the Cooper brothers, the killers, for life, Judge Thomas told the siblings, "The use of poison in a case such as this demonstrates a cold-blooded intention to kill, regardless of the consequences. You work together hand in glove in planning and carrying out the murder of a joyful and bubbly young woman, brutally betrayed by a man she loved and his brother." DCI Caroline Marsh, senior investigating officer, shared her views on this case outside court. She said, "I would say this is the most callous offense I've ever investigated. Most murders that occur are spontaneous events driven by anger or jealousy. Whereas in this case, what we uncovered was weeks of planning to kill Samina and a really unusual cause of death. We rarely see chloroform homicides. It's a mystery to the investigation why David Cooper would do something like this for his brother. An extreme act to kill a woman that he hardly knew. Their cryptic messages and meticulous planning failed in the face of justice, ensuring they'll spend all of their remaining Christmases behind bars, serving their deserved punishment. The anguish of losing Samina in such cruel circumstances was overwhelming for the family." The statement released by Samina's younger brother, Imran Imam, reflected the profound impact of her loss. He mourned not only the loss of his sister, but also the absence of her guidance and support during challenging times. Imran expressed the torment of contemplating Samina's final moments and the pain of not being able to seek her counsel anymore. The reminders of her absence were constant, with everyday triggers evoking memories that intensified their grief. This made it even more challenging to come to terms with their loss. The family's sentiments echoed a collective sense of shock, sorrow, and fear as they grappled with the reality of Samina's untimely and tragic demise, leaving an irreparable void in their lives. As we close this chapter on the tragedy of Samina Imam, it's impossible not to be shaken by the sheer senselessness of it all. Roger had countless opportunities to avoid this irreversible path. He could have chosen honesty, transparency, or even simply ending the relationship. Instead, he and his brother embarked on a calculated, cruel course of action that resulted in the loss of a vibrant life. This case stands as a stark example of the devastating consequences that can unfold when we prioritize personal desires over basic human decency. Let it serve as a cautionary tale, urging us to choose compassion and integrity over expediency and self-interest. May Simeon's memory inspire us to uphold the values of honesty, respect, and accountability, ensuring that such a tragedy never befalls another innocent soul. Willie James Howard, born on July 13, 1928, in Suwannee County, Florida, was the cherished only son of James and Lula Howard. From a young age, he stood out as a bright, cheerful, and talented boy. By the time he was a sophomore in high school, his friends recognized him for his impressive singing abilities. Willie was the kind of happy, likable, and gifted kid that anyone would want as a friend, always dressed neatly and well-groomed. His politeness defined him. He treated everyone with respect, from his peers to the elders in the community. This kind demeanor won him many admirers, especially among the local girls. A retired teacher from La Francis Stevens, the African-American school Willie attended, described him as an exceptionally respectful and genuinely kind young man. She noted that if he saw someone approaching, he would graciously step aside. Although she never had the opportunity to teach him since her focus was on girls, she was always struck by his joyful spirit and musical talent. Willie lived with his parents, who both worked hard, yet it was challenging for them to afford nice clothes and shoes for him. This was particularly disheartening for them, as Willie loved to dress well and sometimes had to ask others for clothing. Despite their efforts, it was difficult to provide him with stylish outfits. For such a bright and beloved boy, his family lived a humble yet peaceful life. In 1943, at just 15 years old, Willie landed a seasonal job as a delivery boy at the Van Priest 5 and Dime store in downtown Live Oak during the Christmas holidays. This opportunity was significant for an African-American boy like Willie, as it was rare for stores at that time to hire black employees due to prevailing racist attitudes. The store also employed some Caucasian workers, and Willie broke stereotypes, standing out as he didn't fit the typical image of a poor African-American youth from his neighborhood or the Deep South during that era. Now, at one point, when Willie was working at the store, he became really infatuated with a 17-year-old white girl who worked there by the name of Cynthia Goff. Willie, the quiet observer, used to watch Cynthia from afar, but never gathered the courage to talk to her. Now Willie, being his always nice self, decided to spread some holiday cheer. It was the festive season and everyone was in a joyful mood with family and friends. So Willie took a sweet initiative and sent Christmas cards to all the female co-workers at Van Priest store, wishing them health and happiness. So after spreading the joy with Christmas cards for everyone, Willie was on cloud 9, but his happiness didn't last long. Why? Well, it turned out that one of the store employees spilled the beans that Cynthia, the girl Willie had a crush on, was actually upset about getting a card from him. When Willie heard that Cynthia was upset, he got restless because he never wanted her to feel down. In an attempt to fix things, he decided to send her a personal letter. But little did he know, this well-intentioned move would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. In the letter he wrote, "Dear friend, just a few lines to let you hear from me. I am well and hope you are the same. This is what I said on that Christmas card from WJH with L. I hope you'll understand what I mean. That is what I said now. Please don't get angry with me because you can never tell what may get in somebody. I did not put it in there myself. God did. I can't help what he does. Can I? I know you don't think much about our kind of people, but we don't hate you all. We want to be your friends, but you won't let us. Please don't let anybody see this. I hope I haven't made you mad. If I did, tell me about it and I'll forget about it. I wish this was a northern state. I guess you call me fresh. Write and tell me what you think of me, good or bad. Sincerely yours, with L from YKW to Cynthia Goff. I love your name. I love your voice. For ASH, you are my choice." In the letter to Cynthia, Willie spilled his feelings, sounding like he was asking her to be friends. He wrote, "I know you don't think much of our kind of people, but we don't hate you. We want to be your friend." It's like he sensed that Cynthia might not be too keen on hanging out with people like him. But Willie was still hopeful. Even if Cynthia hadn't been the friendliest to people of his race, Willie, being the hopeful romantic, didn't want to give up on trying because he really liked her. So at 15, Willie had a pretty clear picture of what he wanted in life, and he understood every word he wrote in that letter. It also gives us a peek into Willie's mindset and a glimpse of how some people, not just in his town but all over the country, were thinking during those times. But one thing Willie probably didn't know was that Cynthia's dad was Alex Goff, a respected former member of the Florida House of Representatives. Now we're not sure if Cynthia told about the letter or if Mr. Goff found the letter himself. But on January 2nd, 1944, when he read Willie's letter that he gave to Cynthia, he got seriously angry. Mr. Goff wasn't exactly the hangout with any African-American kind of person. Imagine his shock when he found out that an African-American guy, Willie, had written a letter to his daughter. For Mr. Goff, this was like a total challenge to him and almost a crime in his eyes. So being extremely furious, he rounded up his friends, Reginald H. Scott and Selden B. McCullers, and the three of them decided to pay Willie a visit at his house, supposedly to question him about the letter. But they weren't just armed with questions. They were also armed with guns and other weapons in tow. It seemed like their intentions might have been more than just normal questioning with Willie, but they were planning something more serious. As Mr. Goff and his friends were on their way, Willie, who was still busy with his work at the dime store, got some unsettling news. A fellow employee informed him that 3 white men were heading to his house looking for him. This news got Willie seriously scared, especially since he knew his mom, Lula, was home alone, and he knew what those men could really do. So without wasting a moment, he rushed back home to ensure his mother's safety. As soon as Willie got home, he quickly started telling his mother about the letter and everything that happened and why these men were coming to their house. But before he could finish, at around 10 a.m., those 3 men stormed into his house and started to forcefully pull him away. When Lula saw what was happening, she did everything she could to protect Willie, pleading with them to let him go. She cried, begged, and tried to reason, but Mr. Goff seemed totally consumed by anger and was unwilling to listen to anything. That's when things took a terrifying turn when Mr. Goff pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Lula's head. He demanded that she hand over Willie to them. Being terrified and caught in an impossible situation, Lula reluctantly let the men take Willie away. As the cars drove off with her son, Lula ran after them, crying and screaming for them to let him go. But they didn't stop. Now, after seeing no other way desperately, she rushed to the lumber yard where her husband James worked in hopes to share the dreadful news of Willie's abduction. However, fate had different plans. Before she could even reach there, Mr. Goff and his 2 companions showed up with guns in hand and ordered James to get into the car with them. Now, by the time Lula reached the lumberyard, it was too late. Those men had already taken her son and husband. But there she met the lumberyard owner's wife, who spilled the details about everything that went down and how those 3 men took James with them. From there, the car drove out of town towards the Suwannee River, reaching a bluff in Sulphur Springs. Once they reached the high bank of the river, Mr. Goff had Willie and his father step out of the car. That's when he explained to James about everything Willie was accused of doing. James, even after knowing that his son was innocent and didn't do anything wrong, he felt utterly helpless in that heartbreaking moment. The 3 men tied up Willie's hands and feet, and he just stood there watching helplessly. Then Mr. Goff took on the roles of both judge and jury and asked Willie James if he grasped the so-called penalty for his crime, which, mind you, was just sending a letter to his daughter Cynthia. According to Mr. Goff, Willie committed a crime and he wanted to make an example out of him so that no one else would even think of doing the same in the future. Being terrified, Willie tearfully replied, "Yes, sir," as he faced this bizarre trial, weeping all the while. Mr. Goff turned to James and asked if he had any words for his son. Powerless to change the course of his son's fate, James just shared some comforting words in what he realized were Willie's last moments. "Willie, I cannot do anything for you now. I'm glad I have belonged to the church and prayed for you." Both father and son had tears streaming down their faces. In a poignant final request, Willie asked his father to take his wallet, in a small yet significant exchange in the midst of this heart-wrenching ordeal. Then, without wasting a moment, Mr. Goff took out a gun and aimed it at Willie's head. He gave him a chilling ultimatum: either jump into the water or face what was in the gun. Remember, Willie's hands and feet were still bound. He was gagged and forced into an impossible decision where he had no other choice but to jump into the water and subjected himself to a horrific drowning death. Meanwhile, James, who was helpless, watched his son from a distance, ending his own life and meeting such a tragic end in front of his eyes. Even after doing this, the men seemed like they weren't satisfied. They took James back in the car and left him at the lumberyard, making sure he couldn't try to save his drowning son. Now, when James finished his work shift and returned home with a heavy heart, he had to deliver the devastating news to his wife, Lula. James sadly informed her that Willie wouldn't be coming home again, even though Lula was somewhat prepared for the news since she knew what the man had intended. But hearing it from James, she couldn't hold back her tears. It was a heartbreaking moment for the family. Now, if you think that's the end of the story, then hold on tight because the story doesn't stop there. The white men went back to the Suwannee River, retrieved Willie's body, and buried him, but they weren't done. They crafted their own version of events, and here's where it gets really interesting. Mr. Goff, being a representative with some serious power, headed straight to Tom Henry, the sheriff of Suwannee County, in 1944. There, the 3 men gave Sheriff Tom a written statement in which they shared their side of the story. According to them, they picked up Willie James from his house and brought him to his father, James, with the intention of having his father whip him over the letter. Further, they claimed that upon reaching the river, Willie actually resisted his father's attempt to discipline him. According to them, in his struggle to break free, Willie accidentally fell into the river and drowned himself. They insisted that they tried hard to rescue him while his father supposedly stood by, doing nothing. It was a strategic move on their part, telling their version of events in advance because they knew that the sheriff would believe them more than the Howard family. It was done to secure their innocence and avoid being suspected of Willie's death. But the question was, even if Sheriff Tom decided to buy into the story that Willie drowned himself, why didn't he slap them with a kidnapping charge, even though they themselves had straight up admitted that they grabbed the boy from his house? Even back in Suwannee County in 1944, it was against the law to forcibly take a child from his mother. Yet the white community seemed to swallow the story hook, line, and sinker. In their eyes, the African-American boy's demise was just a tragic accident. In reality, Willie was kidnapped, murdered, and buried within a mere 24 hours without leaving a proper grave marker. Sadly, Willie's case wasn't the only one, and he wasn't the only African-American boy to endure such cruelty. In August 1955, another tragic incident unfolded in Florida with Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy who faced lynching at the hands of 3 white men, all because he supposedly got physical with a white woman. Racism has been around for a long time and, unfortunately, it still exists in many parts of the world. Many cases of lynching have remained hidden which never came to light, and the stories often go unheard. Willie's case would have also been one of those cases, and no one would have ever known until one day, fate took a turn. Elbert C. Robinson, an African-American attorney from Live Oak, then in 1944 living in Washington, D.C., came home for the holidays. There, he heard from the owner of the lumberyard about an African-American child being lynched, and he was so disturbed by this injustice that just 2 days after Willie's murder, on January 4, 1944, Robinson wrote a letter to the NAACP in Washington, D.C. Little did he know that this letter would set in motion the involvement of Thurgood Marshall, who in 1944 became the first African-American person to serve on the United States Supreme Court, ensuring Willie's story wouldn't be buried in silence. The letter dated January 4, 1944 stated, "While visiting in Florida during the Christmas holidays, one of the most gruesome cases imaginable was called to my attention. The people who relayed the facts in this case to me asked that I withhold their names, but implored me to get the facts in this case through to the NAACP as soon as possible. It appears that the conditions there are so tense that the colored people, high and low, are so frightened that they are afraid to have their names identified with cases of this type." After reading that impactful letter, Attorney Robinson not only shared the names of those he'd spoken to, Willie's father, James Howard, the African-American undertaker, Ansel Brown, Reverend R.M. Lane of Live Oak, and Mr. McPherson, the principal of Willie's school, but he also made a request to not publicize these names. Attorney Robinson's intervention actually sparked action into Willie's case. The NAACP sent letters to Florida Governor Holland, urging an investigation into Willie's killing. This move marked the first step toward justice for Willie. The governor also appointed Special Investigator David Lanier from Florida Law Enforcement Agency and instructed him to provide a discreet report on the matter. The wheels of justice started turning, albeit quietly. Investigator Lanier wasted no time and went straight to the heart of the matter, interviewing those involved in Willie's case. His interviews included Sheriff Tom, the 3 men implicated in Willie's death, James, and Luna Howard. However, Luna, in her account to the special investigator, painted a vivid picture. On January 2, 1944, James had left for work at Bon Howell Lumber Company, where Mr. R.L. Howard was his boss. Later that morning, an automobile carrying 3 white men pulled up to my house. From that, 2 white men stood at the gate, in which one was named Mr. McCullough, and the identity of the other man remained unknown to me. The third man was Mr. Phil Goff. Suddenly, Willie walked into the house and Mr. Goff seized him, insisting him to come along. I frantically tried to pull Willie away, begging and asking what he had done. In the midst of this, Mr. Goff produced a revolver, pointing it at me. He forcibly dragged Willie to the car, joined by the other white men, and sped off towards Live Oak. I chased after the car, but it quickly got away from me. Once the interviews were done, Investigator Lanier was convinced that the 3 men were responsible for Willie's tragic end. In his report to the governor, David Lanier straightforwardly stated that the men were guilty of murder if they were guilty of anything. In response, on February 14, 1944, Governor Holland wrote to Thurgood Marshall attaching a copy of Lanier's report. However, the governor also cautioned Marshall about the challenges ahead, emphasizing the difficulties when the testimony of 3 white men and the girl would likely stand against the account of 1 African-American man. Despite having all the information, fighting for this case remained an uphill battle. The pursuit of justice for Willie took an unexpected turn at the Sewanee Courthouse on May 4, 1944. The state's attorney brought the Howard killing before a grand jury, but things didn't unfold as anticipated. In a surprising twist, the only witness summoned was James Howard, who had relocated to Orlando by then. The grand jury just had 2 questions for him. How old was the boy? Did he personally deliver the letter to Cynthia Goff? Strangely, there were no inquiries about what transpired at the river. Lula Howard and other potential corroborating witnesses were not called. Even the special investigator Lanier was left out. After responding to the 2 questions, James Howard was dismissed from the grand jury proceedings and was left in the dark about any further developments. But why weren't there any questions about those white men? Why weren't there any questions about how Willie died? Why wasn't it important for the state's attorney? In a final push for justice, Harry T. Moore, the head of the state NAACP and a childhood classmate of Lula Howard, made a valiant effort. Moore conducted his own investigation. He gathered affidavits from the Howard family. He organized an NAACP chapter in Live Oak using the Howard lynching as his rallying cry. Hailing from the same settlement outside Live Oak called Houston, Moore felt a personal connection to Willie's case. He teamed up with Marshall, and they both aimed to involve the federal authorities. But despite the compelling arguments presented by Marshall and Moore, the state chose to remain silent, which only added another chapter to the sadly familiar narrative of justice eluding those who need it most. Following the lynching, Willie James' parents promptly relocated to Orlando, where James Howard passed away a few years later, and Lula Howard lived until 2004. Mamie, Lula's sister, shared in a 2006 interview in Orlando that Lula's heart remained broken throughout her life. Willie was her only child and had left an indelible mark on her, a wound that time couldn't fully heal. Even after decades, some Caucasian individuals in Live Oak continued to cling to the drowning myth. In an interview on October 19, 2006, Susan K. Lamb, the editor of the Sewanee Democrat, the town's newspaper, adamantly stated, "It was not a lynching, it was a drowning." According to her, the boy was supposedly running away and met his demise in the river. When questioned about the practicality of running with bound hands and feet, her response was simply, "Isn't that interesting?" Willie James Howard was laid to rest in Live Oak's Eastside Cemetery, resting in anonymity for over 60 years with no marker on his grave. It was finally in 2005 when Douglas Udall, a Sewanee County commissioner and mortician, took the initiative. Having acquired the funeral home and records from Ansel Brown, who'd handled Willie James' burial, Commissioner Odell funded and arranged for a long overdue grave marker. Additionally, he organized a church service to honor Willie James, a poignant tribute that had been absent at the time of his tragic death. Now Douglas Odell stands as a testament to the evolving landscape of African-American political influence in Sewanee County, once among Florida's most conservative regions. Despite a district with a majority of white voters, Udall was elected chairman of the Sewanee County Commission in November 2007, showcasing a shift in the county's political dynamics. Also in 2006, Sewanee County Sheriff Tony Cameron demonstrated a rare commitment by attending the memorial service for Willie James, one of the few Caucasian people to do so. His presence spoke volumes, saying, "I thought I should be there." Sheriff Cameron's assistance extended to aiding Douglas Udall's research efforts. He reached out to Cynthia Goff's best friend from his office, revealing that Cynthia, although no longer residing in Live Oak, occasionally visits there. The friend shared that Cynthia was deeply distressed by Willie James' tragic fate, expressing, "She did not intend for that to happen. I think it stayed with her all of her life." Cynthia never married and spent her life working in downtown stores, including the Van Priest dime store. This incident had a profound impact on everyone involved and disrupted their lives permanently. During that period, racism deeply influenced society and created a stark division between African American and Caucasian people. Caucasians were often considered superior, while African Americans faced unjust perceptions of inferiority. Over time, society has evolved, and today, people from all backgrounds are treated with equal respect and offered opportunities regardless of their race. Presently, individuals of all races, including white people, embrace diversity and easily interact with one another. Yet some lingering perceptions suggest that Willie may have believed he could navigate a racially biased world, relying on charm, style, singing talent, and an unconventional job choice. The complexities of his motivations during those times continue to fuel discussions. It's hard to definitively say why Willie wrote the letter to Cynthia. Some might argue he wrote it out of pride in himself, believing he could break social barriers. On the other hand, it's also possible that Willie genuinely had feelings for Cynthia, hoping to build a connection despite the racial challenges of the time. The complexities of human emotions make it challenging to pinpoint a single motivation behind Willie's actions. The situation raised many questions about the role of fear, power dynamics, and societal pressures during those challenging times. The truth remains buried in traditional thinking, lingering racism, and the feeling of a justice that was never fully realized. So we leave you with this: what are your thoughts on whether James truly chose not to save Willie, or if external factors hindered his ability to intervene? Additionally, considering the gravity of the situation, what punishment, in your opinion, would be fitting for the three men involved in taking Willie's life? John Jack Cummings was a student at the University of Wisconsin in 1942 when he enlisted in the Army. On January 23, 1945, his parents, Helen and Leo, received a telegram at their home in Juneau, Wisconsin, informing them that their son was missing in action. Initial military records indicated that Jack went missing on January 4, 1945, but this date was slightly inaccurate. On the night of December 31, 1944, the German army launched Operation Nordwind, their final large-scale offensive on the Western Front against the U.S. 7th Army, which was stretched thin along a 68-mile front. At that time, Jack was serving with Company A, 270th Infantry Regiment, 70th Infantry Division, which had arrived at the Rhine River just 2 days prior to reinforce the Alsace area. The men of Company A were positioned along the French side of the river in foxholes, instructed to remain vigilant for German soldiers across the water. They were also ordered to remove any unit patches or identifying insignia from their uniforms to prevent the Germans from gathering intelligence about troop movements if any were captured. Unfortunately, this directive would later complicate the identification of soldiers' remains. On December 31st, 22-year-old Jack was stationed in a foxhole approximately 10 yards back from the riverbank near the French village of Neuhäusel, armed with a Browning automatic rifle. Two of his fellow soldiers saw him there early that night as darkness began to fall, and he reported that he was doing well. Sometime later, however, they heard machine gun fire and rushed back to Jack's position. When they arrived, instead of finding Jack, they found his helmet with a bullet hole in it and a bloody piece of skull. Jack's weapon and equipment were also gone. There were drag marks in the ground down to the river. The Army officially confirmed that Jack was dead in November of 1945. A report from the Army stated, "It can be presumed that Cummings was killed by the enemy and his body thrown into the Rhine River. Further search for the remains of this soldier would be futile." Jack's family was not so easily convinced that finding Jack's remains and having them returned home for burial was a lost cause. They received limited information from the Army as years passed, but tried to be active in the search for Jack's body. In 1947, Jack's mother Helen wrote to the Army about offering a reward in Germany for information that would lead them to Jack's remains. She was willing to pay for such a reward, but was asking for the Army's help in spreading information about the reward within Germany. The Army told Helen that they could not help her. Both Helen and her husband, Leo, would die without seeing their son's remains returned home. Leo passed away in 1963, and Helen passed away in 1972. Jack's younger sister, Mary Ellen, eventually married, and she and her husband had 12 children. According to one of those children, Jack's nephew, Mark Hartzheim, his grandparents rarely discussed his Uncle Jack. They just never talked about this much. That was typical, I think, of people from that generation. They compartmentalized things and internalized them and didn't dwell on them, but I'm sure it haunted them and troubled them the rest of their lives," he told the Washington Post in 2018. It would be Mark who set in motion the events that ultimately led to Jack's remains being identified and returned to the United States. He began doing research on his uncle, and in 2014, he signed up to attend a government-sponsored meeting for family members of missing in action soldiers. Once he did so, a government historian named Ian Spurgeon was assigned to revisit Jack's case. When he began his work on Jack's case, Ian found that Jack's files had not been accessed for decades. He began using these files, the National Archives, and a Defense Palmia Accounting Agency database of locations where the remains of unidentified World War II servicemen had been recovered. Ian focused on the area where Jack had gone missing and presumably been killed, and came across an account of a soldier working for the American Graves Registration Command in a grave he had discovered in Eifsheim, Germany, right across the Rhine River from Jack's last post. In 1946, the mayor of Eifsheim told this soldier that another American soldier was buried in the area. The grave was roughly 30 yards away from the river behind a German pillbox. It was marked with a wooden cross on which was written, in German, "Here lies a fallen USA soldier," and the date of December 31, 1944. The Graves registration soldier was able to speak to a former German soldier who had helped bury the American soldier and still lived in the area. He confirmed that the soldier buried in the grave was an American. The nameless soldier had been killed near New Household by members of a German raiding party that had attacked across the river on New Year's Eve of 1944. On May 10, 1946, the remains were exhumed. By this time, only the soldier's skeleton remained, and there were only scraps of his clothing left. No dog tags were found with the remains. Since the soldier could not be identified, the remains were given the designation X-454 and ultimately buried in an American cemetery in France known today as the Lorraine American Cemetery, along with thousands of other unidentified American servicemen. Ian then began the process of filing a request with the Army to exhume the remains in order to scientifically analyze them to confirm if they belonged to Jack Cummings. He conducted further research and eliminated other soldiers as potential matches before making the formal request. The Army agreed to it, and the remains designated as X-6454 were disinterred in October of 2016 and flown to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska for testing at a Defense Palmia Accounting Agency laboratory. The bones were examined by anthropologists, and Jack's relatives provided samples of their DNA for comparison. On July 23, 2018, Mark Hartzheim was driving his 7-year-old son to the movies when he received a phone call informing him that the remains had been confirmed to be those of his uncle, Jack Cummings. On October 13, 2018, Jack was buried with honors in Hazelhurst, Wisconsin, next to his parents. His sister, Mary Ellen, who was just 17 years old when her brother was killed, was still alive at age 91 to see her brother finally return home. Lawrence Everett Dixon was born in 1920 and was a native of South Carolina. He loved music and taught himself how to play the guitar. He had a warm and friendly personality, according to those who knew him. Lawrence eventually moved north to New York City and studied chemistry for 2 years at the City College of New York. While still in New York, he married his wife, Phyllis, in November of 1941. The following July, the couple welcomed their daughter Marla. When World War II broke out, Lawrence joined the Army Air Forces and became one of 900 African-American pilots who trained at the segregated Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. He graduated from flight training on March 25, 1943, in Class 43C. That December, he became one of 400 Tuskegee airmen who flew overseas during the war when he deployed to Italy with the 100th Fighter Squadron. In the following year, he flew over 60 missions and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain Dixon would have been eligible to temporarily return home on leave after flying 70 missions. At the time, weight pilots received their leave after flying 50 missions. On December 23, 1944, 24-year-old Captain Dixon took off for his 68th mission in his P-51D Mustang at Ramiatelli Air Base in southern Italy. He was flying to Nazi-occupied Prague, leading a 3-plane escort of an unarmed photo reconnaissance plane. Approximately an hour into their flight, Captain Dixon radioed the other planes that he was having engine problems and his plane was losing speed. His two wingmen remained behind with him while the reconnaissance plane sped on. They stayed with Captain Dixon's plane as he turned around trying to head back to base. Captain Dixon then began losing altitude and started to look for somewhere to land his plane or bail out of it. Ultimately, he had to jettison the canopy of his cockpit and bail out of the aircraft. According to Second Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, he had to swerve his own plane to avoid being hit by the now unpiloted plane, and when he was able to look back out of his window, he could not see Captain Dixon's parachute or any other indication of where he had landed. At the time, he believed they were in a mountainous area near the town of Darvigio in northeastern Italy. Lieutenant Martin and the other wingmen circled the area looking for any signs of where Captain Dixon was, but heavy snow on the ground hampered their efforts, and they saw nothing. They began returning to base but turned around to look for the crash site one more time. They again saw nothing. They finally flew back to Ramitelli and reported the crash, but no further searches were launched at the time. Captain Dixon's wife, Phyllis, was notified that he was missing in action on January 8, 1945. She spent months writing to the War Department asking for updates about her husband. At first, she held out hope that he might still be alive but in need of help, writing, "I can't even sleep for thinking about him being sick somewhere and not having anyone to care for him properly." Months would go by without any information, leading her to say in a July letter, "Please believe me when I say I have been greatly distressed. I have tried to be brave, but it really has been an effort. I meet the mailman daily hoping and praying for some news, but so far, none." The Army conducted investigations into Captain Dixon's crash in 1946 and 1948. Their efforts located other crash sites, but not Captain Dixon's. The Army declared his remains unrecoverable on September 29, 1949. Captain Dixon's wife, Phyllis, would never receive the news of her husband she tried hard to get from the Army. She passed away on December 28, 2017 at the age of 96. Less than a year later, however, her daughter Marla would finally get answers about her father's fate. Phyllis had died knowing that efforts were being made to finally locate her husband's remains. In the summer of 2017, the family had been notified by the Army's past conflict reparations branch that new efforts were being launched to locate where Captain Dixon had crashed. Thanks to testimony from witnesses and the examination of wartime German records, the Army had learned of a crash site with wreckage consistent with the aircraft Captain Dixon had been flying on his final mission. Records showed a crash that occurred on the day of Captain Dixon's crash, but the aircraft in question had not gone down in Italy, as the Army had believed, but just over the Austrian border near Hohenthorn from July 11th through August 8, 2017. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, the University of New Orleans, and the University of Innsbruck excavated the crash site. Among the airplane pieces and debris at the site, they found human remains. These remains were sent to a laboratory at Offutt Air Force Base outside Omaha, Nebraska for testing. DNA was successfully extracted from arm and leg bone fragments. Captain Dixon's daughter, as well as several other of his family members, had provided samples of their DNA for comparison in hopes of his remains being located and conclusively identified. On July 27, 2018, the Defense Department announced that the remains had been identified as those of Captain Dixon. At the end of World War II, 27 Tuskegee Airmen were missing in action. Captain Dixon was the first of them to be located since the end of the war. That August, Michael Mee, the identifications chief for the Army's past conflict reparations branch, presented Captain Dixon's daughter, Marla, with a gold ring and an aqua-colored stone believed to have fallen from it that were found at the crash site. The ring was inscribed with her parents' initials, a heart, and the date of her father's 23rd birthday. Marla believed the ring was a gift from her mother to her father for his birthday. He had loved the color aqua. Small portions of a harmonica and a small cross found amongst the debris at the crash site were also returned to Marla. Captain Dixon's wife Phyllis had remarried and had 2 more children, so Marla grew up with siblings and a stepfather. However, she never stopped missing her father for feeling as though her life would have been different had she not felt the void his loss had left in her life. She was always looking for ways to connect with her father and kept his files and displayed his photographs in her home. Her father's wingman, Lieutenant Robert L. Martin, wrote her a letter detailing her father's final mission some 50 years after the war ended, so that she would know as much of his story as possible. The act of writing to you so many years after brings to me a sadness, and yet I hope it will bring you a moment of peaceful remembrance of a loving father whom you lost, Lieutenant Martin wrote. He passed away at his home in Olympia Fields, Illinois the day before the announcement of Captain Dixon's remains being formally identified was made. He was 99 years old. Lieutenant Martin's daughter, Gabrielle, came in her father's place to honor Captain Dixon when he finally received a proper burial. On March 22, 2019, nearly 75 years after his death, Captain Dixon was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. His daughter and the grandchildren he never got to meet were there for the service and to receive the flag from his casket. At the beginning of 1972, 9-year-old Deborah Lynn Randall was a third grader at Pine Forest Elementary School, living with her family in Marietta, Georgia. She loved playing with dolls and was also the star of her neighborhood baseball team. Her favorite teammate was her 10-year-old brother, Melvin. On January 13, 1972, Melvin was feeling unwell, and their mother, Juanita, who was also sick, asked Melvin and Debbie to take the family's laundry to the Duds and Suds laundromat, just half a block from their apartment. Reluctant to go due to his illness and distracted by his favorite TV show, Melvin opted to stay behind. Consequently, Debbie and her stepfather, Frank, headed to the laundromat with the laundry. Debbie wore a new pair of lavender shoes she had received for Christmas and enjoyed visiting the laundromat, where she would often stack empty detergent boxes or bring her Barbie dolls to play with other neighborhood girls. When they arrived at the laundromat, Frank loaded 2 machines with laundry and gave Debbie the change she would need to switch out the loads once they finished. He then went home, expecting her to return by 7:30 asking for help carrying the laundry. As time passed without her return, concern grew, especially with nightfall approaching. Juanita and Frank went to the laundromat to check on her and discovered a spilled box of detergent on the ground next to a Volkswagen parked about 85 feet from the store. Debbie was nowhere to be found. According to some girls who had been folding laundry at the laundromat, Debbie had gone outside at 7:15, telling them goodbye as she left. It soon became apparent that Debbie had been abducted. Debbie's father, John, was notified while he was at his job at the Ford Motor Company plant. The Marietta police were called, and they found small fingerprints on the Volkswagen smudged in a downward direction. Witnesses reported seeing a dark 1950s pickup truck speeding away from the area of the laundromat and driving erratically. Police eventually learned that a 12-year-old girl witnessed the actual abduction. She had not reported it immediately because she believed the little girl she saw a man grab must have been his child who had misbehaved and was being taken home. The man nearly ran her over as he sped away, and she could briefly see him glaring back at her in the truck's rearview mirror as he drove away. Another witness saw a man driving a pickup truck similar to the one later seen speeding away from the scene around 7 p.m. as it parked next to the Volkswagen where child-sized fingerprints were later found. These 2 witnesses were able to help develop a sketch of the driver. The official search for Debbie involved the Marietta Police Department, the Cobb County Police, and the Cobb County Sheriff's Office. In addition, the people of Marietta joined together to launch Operation Debbie, a massive search effort looking for the little girl. More than 4,000 people were ultimately involved in the search. Among the volunteers were civil defense workers, ham radio operators, and students. One of the most dedicated volunteers was Melvin Randall, who had struggled with guilt for several years over being sick and not going to the laundromat with his little sister the day she disappeared. He went door to door speaking with all of his neighbors and distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood, desperately hoping his efforts would bring Debbie home. January 29th, 16 days after Debbie disappeared, was cold and rainy, but the volunteers continued their work. A group of students from Southern Tech were searching a heavily wooded area between Windy Hill Road and the Fox Hills subdivision on Powers Ferry Road. Mike McCahan had enrolled in the school after serving with the military in Vietnam. He had been searching for several hours when he came across drag marks in the dirt around 5 p.m. When he followed them, he discovered Debbie's lifeless body. She was fully clothed but had only her socks on her feet. Her prized lavender shoes were gone. Most of Marietta seemed to show up to honor Debbie's memory at her funeral. Thousands of people were packed into Roswell Street Baptist Church for the service. Debbie was then buried at Kennestone Memorial Park. Debbie's body was found approximately 6 miles away from where she was abducted. Dr. Larry Howard of the Georgia State Crime Lab examined Debbie's body and determined that she had been raped. The most recent statements from authorities say that Debbie's cause of death was strangulation, but earlier ones state that she had been suffocated. It has been reported that Dr. Howard believed that Debbie died as the result of her killer using her coat to cover her face in an effort to muffle her screams while he raped her. A geologist was brought into the investigation to analyze dirt samples taken from Debbie's clothing. They identified dirt from 2 different locations, one from where Debbie's body was found and another ultimately matched to clay from the Dixie Cast and Stone Company on Powers Ferry Road, some 3 miles away from where Debbie's body was found. This led investigators to believe that Debbie was killed on the Stone Company property and that her body had then been dumped in the wooded area where it had been found. Brown hair was also found on Debbie's body, and the lab determined that it came from a white male, most likely between the ages of 18 and 30. Police conducted numerous interviews and followed up on hundreds of leads, but Debbie's killer remained unidentified. The death of Debbie and the lack of punishment for her killer obviously took a massive toll on her family. She was my baby, and I loved her so much. I couldn't understand why it was her instead of me. It was the way she had to go that hurt me so bad. And it still hurts. I would at least like to know who done it before I pass away, Debbie's mother, Juanita, said in July of 2018 as she battled leukemia. Juanita, unfortunately, did not get her wish to live to see her daughter's killer identified. She passed away on September 17, 2018. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were buried alongside Debbie's body. Describing what losing Debbie felt like to reporter Jessica Knoll in 2018, Debbie's father John tearfully said, "Somebody took my baby. Tears you up, literally tears you up. I was like a zombie around here for a while. It's just like taking a big chunk out of your body. When I found that out, it was just like losing a part of me being gone. It was gone, and it ain't never come back, and never will it come back." John participated in the interview with Jessica Knoll because he still hoped to live to see Debbie's killer brought to justice. He believed there were people who had information on the case, and he did the interview in hopes of one of them seeing it and coming forward. He believed that if Debbie's killer was still alive and could be prosecuted, he should be executed following his conviction because he obviously was not sorry for what he had done, as evidenced by the fact that he had never come forward. Like his ex-wife, John died without ever seeing justice for his daughter. He passed away in January of 2022, just 3 days before the 50th anniversary of Debbie's murder. While he was not alive to see it, Debbie's case would finally be solved the very next year. By the times of their deaths, Debbie's parents at least knew that police were still looking for their daughter's killer, and that technology that had not yet been available at the time of Debbie's murder was being used to hopefully solve the case. Luckily, the original investigators assigned to Debbie's case had preserved the evidence from the case very well. What would prove to be the 2 most useful pieces of evidence in the age of DNA testing, the hair found on Debbie's body and a small piece of cloth found next to her body, were preserved well enough to still be usable for testing even decades after Debbie's death. In 2001, the FBI conducted testing on the hair. They could not identify Debbie's killer, but the testing did narrow the suspect pool considerably. The case was handed over to the Cobb County Cold Case Unit in 2015. That same year, the evidence in the case was sent for more DNA testing. A partial male profile was developed, but a match to it could not be found in the combined DNA index system. Investigators with the Cold Case Unit developed several strong suspects, but each was ultimately excluded by DNA. Thanks to extra funding received in 2019, further advanced DNA testing was conducted on the cloth in 2022. A familial DNA profile was developed and investigators used genetic genealogy to search for potential suspects. The Cobb County Cold Case Unit began working with DNA Labs International in 2023. They were able to identify several relatives of the contributor of the DNA from the cloth. When authorities contacted these relatives, they agreed to provide samples of their DNA. Comparing their DNA with the DNA from the cloth helped give the authorities had his body exhumed so that samples could be taken for direct DNA testing. This testing confirmed his DNA was a match to that from the crime scene. On September 18, 2023, Cobb County District Attorney Flynn D. Brody Jr. announced that Debbie's killer had been identified as William Beal Rose, who had been 24 years old at the time of the murder. Rose could not be arrested because he took his own life in 1974, 2 years after Debbie was killed. Gold case investigator Roy Alter stated at the press conference announcing Rose's identification that he suspected Rose may have ended his life because he was afraid of being caught for Debbie's murder. According to Mr. Alter's conversations with Rose's family members, Rose had been worried about going to jail prior to his death, but his family had assumed his concerns stemmed from minor incidents. Rose did have a criminal record but had only ever been arrested for alcohol-related incidents. He had not previously been a suspect in the case. It does not appear that Rose knew Debbie prior to her abduction. However, he did have relatives who lived in her apartment complex, giving him a reason to be a regular visitor there. He may have seen her playing outside during prior visits to the complex, but her murder appears to have been a crime of opportunity. Debbie's brother, Melvin, was present at the press conference to express his gratitude for investigators and their ongoing efforts. He was relieved both because he finally knew who took his sister from him and because her killer was not someone his family knew. Melvin had ultimately resolved the guilt he had once felt for not being with Debbie at the laundromat that day, and he has stated that he does not hate Rose despite what he did to his sister because he had learned over the years that hating someone would do him no good. Melvin expressed sympathy towards Rose's family for the difficult time he knows they must be going through as a result of this news. Rose's identification was somewhat bittersweet for Melvin because his mother did not get to see it. However, he stated, "I wish my mother was here, but I know she knows in heaven that it's finally over." In May 2003, Tiffany Rowell and Rachel Colorutis, along with many others, proudly graduated from their high school. They were stepping into a new chapter of their lives with exciting summer plans alongside friends and family. Tiffany aimed to become a social worker, while Rachel considered joining the military. Tiffany's boyfriend of 3 years, Marcus, was also heading to college, and his cousin Adelbert, who had recently relocated to Clear Lake for a fresh start, had ambitious plans as well. Following the death of Tiffany's mother, her father remarried and moved away. Tiffany chose to stay in the house to avoid changing schools so close to graduation. The following 6 weeks were filled with parties at Tiffany's, juggling jobs, saving for college, and enjoying summer together before they all headed in different directions. On the afternoon of July 18, 2003, police received a call from 2 neighbors who had visited Tiffany. They entered her house and stumbled upon a shocking scene that no one could have foreseen, for people lay dead. The floor and walls were covered in blood, and it was obvious that they had all been deceased for several hours already. It was a shocking sight for even the most tenured of police officers. The victims were 18-year-olds, Tiffany Rowell and Rachel Colorutis, Tiffany's boyfriend, 19-year-old Marcus Priscilla and Marcus's cousin, 21-year-old Adelbert Sanchez. Tiffany, Marcus, and Adelbert had all been shot to death. And although Rachel had been shot multiple times, she had died of blunt force trauma to her head, and her skull was completely shattered. There was no forced entry. The TV was still blaring, and the way the group had been found indicated it was a total ambush that had happened in a mere matter of seconds. Rachel was found on the floor with her hand near her phone. She had managed to hit the 911 buttons to try and call for help, but before any call could go through, she was hit over the head, likely with a gun, undyed. There was a clump of hair in her right hand, and she had been shot at least 12 times. Tiffany and Adelbert were on the recliners, their legs stretched out while they had been relaxing watching television, and Marcus was found behind the seats on the floor. Over 40 bullets had been fired in the house, and there was a mixture of 2 different shell casings. No guns were found at the scene, but police could tell that one was a 9mm and one was a .38 caliber. So investigators felt confident they were looking for at least 2 people involved, maybe even more. As the media got hold of the story and news began to spread, Rachel's father George recognized the address on television and headed straight over with his wife. The cameras picked up the heartbreaking moment. He pleaded with the police to let him in. But as it was now a crime scene, it was simply not allowed. They both collapsed to the ground, waiting for someone to tell them something, but knowing deep down they wouldn't see their daughter alive again. It was disturbing and shocking that something like this could happen in broad daylight in a neighborhood where very little went on. Former classmates of Tiffany said that her home had quickly become known as a party house with drinking and drugs, and often lots of people coming in and out, especially now that it was summer break. So they wondered if maybe an alcohol or drug-fueled party had become really out of control. That's not what this particular day had been. The four were the closest of friends, and for all intents and purposes, it had just been a very casual afternoon for them, watching television and eating food. Friends, students, and neighbors gathered together for vigils, and a sense of unease hovered over everyone. 18-year-old Tiffany always had the biggest smile on her face. As well as wanting to go into social work, she was a talented actress and loved any chance to perform. Rachel Colorutis also loved the arts and creative writing, and was very popular in school due to her kind nature. People said that she, too, was always smiling, happy, and fun to be around. Marcus's stepfather said Marcus loved nothing more than working on his car and spending time with his family and Tiffany. He had been finishing a course for an automotive technology certificate and wanted to pursue a business degree. His cousin Adalbert had moved to Clear Lake to get away from violence on the north side, and had only been there for a couple of weeks before he was killed. He loved making music and planned to go to college to study computer technology. People could not believe that something this brutal could happen to them, and this seemingly random crime had rattled the community. Sadly, there really were no witnesses. No one had heard any gunshots. The houses were very separated, and police said lots of people had their air conditioning and fans on, which could have blocked out the noise. But a couple living nearby had seen something they thought might be relevant. They had seen a very young man and a woman walking down the street at about 2:30 p.m. that day. And to the best of their knowledge, they hadn't seen them before. They were dressed all in black. The woman was wearing a bandana, carrying a big black bag, and the neighbors described her as very pretty with big eyes. The witnesses gave the best description they could to the renowned forensic artist Lois Gibson, who worked with what they could remember, putting together a potential profile. But whether these people were in any way linked was really unclear. Just 2 hours later, Lois had completed the sketches. George, Rachel's father, started working non-stop to try and raise money so they could afford to put the sketches out on billboards, and spent most of his time going door to door handing out flyers. Early on, rumors began to swirl that Marcus had been involved in dealing drugs, and maybe this was behind the ambush. It was also alleged that Marcus's family had connections to the Mexican mafia, and perhaps the other three had been collateral damage to a completely unrelated thing. A close friend of Tiffany's said, "I know Marcus was messed up with some bad people." But Marcus's aunt said, "He struggled, but he succeeded. No matter how hard he was trying, he was doing the best to do good." One detective said they were all very young, very immature, and on their own for the first time. The May 4th have exercised bad judgment at times, but certainly didn't deserve what happened to them. Officers simply couldn't find anything to solidify the claims about the mafia, and this theory was eventually ruled out. Police did wonder, however, if drugs were involved somehow, but they just didn't have anything yet that pointed to that, as both drugs and cash were found at the scene in plain view. So why hadn't they been stolen? The attack had been so ruthless and felt so personal. Police then started to wonder if it was someone close to the group. Amongst her multiple shots, Rachel had been shot in the crotch area, and psychiatrists wondered if this was a sign of sexual envy or jealousy. But they were ruling people out at a rapid speed rather than adding any suspects to the list. There was simply no one they could link to the group that would have any motive to do this. Time was slowly ticking by, and investigators had no more than they did when they first started. As the weeks turned into months, the months soon turned into years. Their confidence in catching whoever was responsible was dwindling. Fast forward to the summer of 2006, almost 3 years to the day after the shootings. After following leads that went nowhere and interviewing 100 people, police finally had a breakthrough. An anonymous tip came in via Crime Stoppers. The person on the end of the phone said they had seen the billboard and gave the police 2 names. The first was Christine Payalila, and the second was Chris. The tipster had met Christine in rehab as she was battling a heroin addiction. She had recently split from this mystery man called Chris and was seemingly trying to turn her life around. While in rehab, she made a comment about her ex-boyfriend shooting up a house and killing a group of people, and she had also participated. He didn't know if the story was true or if it was the drugs talking, but after seeing the billboard for himself, he decided to call in. A look into the name Christine Paolilla told the police a lot. It turned out that Christine had gone to Clear Lake High School alongside Tiffany and Rachel, and the connections started to be made. Those in Christine's life said that she had had a tough time in school and was subjected to relentless bullying and attacks from classmates. Her mother and stepfather said that she had been diagnosed with alopecia when she was very young and began wearing wigs, which were frequently ripped off her head by other students. Her mom, Lori, said she had poor vision, so she had what I guess most folks would know as Coke bottle glasses. This, as well as her wearing wigs, meant she faced ridicule on a daily basis. Her mother said that one day Christine came home from school and said, "Mom, I made 2 new friends who were the sweetest girls I ever met, Rachel and Tiffany, none other than Rachel Kolaroutis and Tiffany Rowell." People said that the two almost took Christine under their wings, forming a genuine and tight friendship. Rachel and Tiffany started looking out for her, trying their best to protect her from the bullying. Christine's mom said she couldn't speak highly enough about them, how much fun they were, how loving they were, how they had so much fun. Every minute they spent together was lively and fun, and they laughed all the time, and I saw such a change in her personality. Rachel's father also knew of Christine and said Rachel was the kind of person that always looked out for the underdog, always tried to help others. Rachel even kept a photo of Christine in her purse. On the back of the picture, Christine had written, "Damn, we've had some crazy memories. I love you." The 3 teens would often write notes back and forth to each other in class, and Lori recalled that Christine trusted them both so much, she felt okay without the wig on, which is not something she did with many of her friends. The trio would spend hours after school doing each other's makeup and trying on different wigs, having fun, but also making Christine feel comfortable and confident. The girls pushed Christine to try new things and find her creativity. And with this, Christine's confidence began to grow and she was really coming into her own. She got a huge boost when she was voted Miss Irresistible by the student body at Clear Lake High School. She finally felt like she was leaving her past behind. Christine soon met Chris Snyder. He was 2 years older than her, and the pair struck up a friendship. Lori said she immediately disapproved of this, but said her daughter wouldn't hear anything bad said about him. Chris ended up serving time for armed robbery, and when he got out, he went straight back to Christine, who was now 16 years old. Christine said that she felt bad because nobody wanted to be associated with him, and knowing how this felt, she stood by him. They soon became romantically involved, and Christine had become more and more distant from her family. Lori said Christine clung on to him for reasons she didn't understand, despite him often joining in with the bullying. Chris was using a lot of drugs at the time, and before long, so was Christine. Her parents spoke to lawyers and the police, even trying to get a restraining order against him, but Christine was now almost 18 years old and was making her own decisions. Her stepfather said she felt she was going to be able to fix him no matter what he did, but others said that the toxicity came from both of them, with people often seeing Christine hitting him and shouting and fighting in public. Although this relationship was already on a downward spiral, 2 people that seemed to be constantly positive and have good energy in her life were Rachel and Tiffany, who stayed just as close to her throughout her relationship with Chris. On the day the group were found dead, Lori said Christine had come home in floods of tears, crying through most of the night. She said she was so upset, she couldn't attend their funerals. So, with the police knowing all of this, it begged the question, why would someone that was so close to the victims do something like that? How could Christine possibly have been involved? The only person that could answer that question was her. And officers started searching for Christine Paolilla and Chris Snyder. The hunt for Chris proved harder as he was not living at his last known address. But thanks to ATM and bank records, Christine and her husband, Justin, were located. They were hauled up in a San Antonio motel, having lived there for almost a year. When officers announced themselves and entered, they walked into what they described as one of the most disgusting things they had ever seen. Used needles, rubbish, food, vomit, and drugs littered the floor. Blood and bodily fluids covered the walls and furniture. They said the smell was unlike anything, and the state of Christine and Justin was quite shocking. Wearing blood-stained clothes and covered in track marks, just before noon on July 19, 2006, Christine Paolilla was placed under arrest. Police said it was clear that the pair were so deeply in their addictions, it was likely a matter of time before they died. For the last 9 months, they had been living in the same room, spending every bit of Christine's inheritance money on drugs. Christine told police she was living off of crackers and spending around $500 a day on heroin, but this amount sometimes reached over $1,000. Justin said Christine hadn't left the room once. Christine's police interview began just before 3 p.m., and over the next few hours, the detective begged her to tell the truth. She admitted to driving Chris to the home that day, but said the murders were all his idea. The plan was to buy drugs from someone inside. Christine said she waited outside in the car before they both drove away. But when Chris said he had forgot something, the pair went back. She initially said that again. She stayed outside hearing no gunshots and seeing nothing wrong. She said she only realized something had happened when he came out holding a gun. After this happened, they drove off and she clocked in to start her shift at Walgreens just 30 minutes later. But the police weren't convinced that this was down to just Chris. Neither were the experts that had analyzed the crime scene. They were still standing by their theory that this was a jealous rage or something to do with sexual envy on Christine's part. Although Rachel and Tiffany had befriended Christine, it was still entirely possible that maybe she didn't believe they were being genuine and wanted to punish them, or her anger at being treated so badly in school had poured over and she had taken it out on them. Officers were trying to get as much information out of her as they could, but as the interview drew to a close, Christine started to grow weaker and more sick. She was transported to Santa Rosa Hospital, where she informed doctors that she was used to taking heroin every 10 to 15 minutes and that she hadn't had any since that morning. After she had been given methadone and morphine, they carried on the interviews inside the hospital, but Christine was still pointing the finger at Chris. She was then put on a plane and flown out to Houston before being placed in a jail cell. A final videotaped interview commenced just before midnight. Her story had now changed. She then said she watched in horror as Chris beat Rachel to death. And according to Christine, he had threatened to do the same thing to her and her family if she told anyone what had happened that night. Police were satisfied that she had finally at least placed herself at the scene. They were still looking for Chris and visited his last known address, his parents' house. They told his family that there was a warrant out for his arrest. They began a search of the property. In his father's bedroom was a little safe which contained 2 guns. Both matched the 2 types that they were looking for. But by this point, no one had seen Chris in over a week. Detectives looked at his MySpace page and phone records, which led them to Greenville, South Carolina. But Chris had already learned about the manhunt before police could even find him. Testing the guns soon linked them back to the crime scene. But before they could place Chris under arrest, his decomposing body was found in some woods. He had taken an overdose of pills. It is thought that someone had tipped him off about the pending arrest and he had taken his own life before they could find him. There was now only one person left to talk to, and that was Christine's husband, Justin. He said that Christine had inherited some money after her father passed away, and the couple had bought a small condo with it. Soon after they started living together, a news story about the anniversary of the unsolved murders came out. Christine called Justin in to watch, asking if the billboard picture looked like her. He said Christine broke down and admitted to going to the house to steal money and drugs. She said she was a willing participant, and when Chris started shooting, she didn't hesitate to join in too. Justin also said that Christine had told him that it was her who beat Rachel to death with the gun, not Chris. He said that Christine told him Rachel was crying, asking why over and over, but she didn't stop until she was sure Rachel was dead. Justin said he was completely shocked and scared, but the couple moved out of the condo and went on the run. It later turned out that the anonymous tip that had been made to Crime Stoppers was actually Justin himself. Christine Paolilla was charged with first-degree murder, and she entered a plea of not guilty. In a pretrial hearing, Christine's defense team moved to suppress all 3 recorded statements. Although she had been advised of her Fifth Amendment rights before each interview, they argued that her statements were technically involuntary because of the medication she had taken and because she was suffering from opioid withdrawal. But this motion was denied, and the court later said Christine was lucid and capable of understanding the warnings given to her and the nature of her statements. A couple of years later, the now 22-year-old's trial got underway. The defense advised that Christine did not testify. They showed her confession tapes reiterating Christine's statement, saying that it was Chris that had killed the group while she hid. The jurors watched her videotape statement in which she told police that Chris was responsible for everything and that she was afraid of him. But the prosecution fired back saying, over 1,100 calls are made from her to him and him to her. If you are so deathly afraid of someone, what are you doing on the phone with them? For over 1,000 phone calls. Dr. George Glass, a psychiatrist testifying for the defense, said that her heroin addiction could not be overlooked. She was in withdrawal at the time she spoke to the police and was saying anything she could to get drugs to relieve the pain. Her lawyer said, "She's upset. She totally understands the grief of the families, her friends, the ones who were killed. She only wishes they could understand that she didn't want any of it to happen, but she understands their grief." Rachel's mother disagreed and said, "I couldn't take my eyes off her. I really hoped to see something in her eyes in the way of remorse. And it was unbelievable, you know. She never shed a tear unless it was for herself." The prosecution said there was plenty that pointed towards her being involved directly, and the fact that she had started her shift at work just half an hour after the ordeal, instead of phoning the police, showed that she was no victim. Her statements were inconsistent, and she had already admitted to 2 people, one of which was her husband, that she had actively taken part of her own accord. The prosecution called her denials and blaming everything on Chris a tired and pathetic tactic. Their star witness was actually her husband, Justin. But the defense argued that Justin's account could not be trusted. They said he was focused purely on money, staying with Christine for her inheritance, and cashing in on the Crime Stoppers' reward by making up a lie. But the jury disagreed. After just 3 hours of deliberations, Christine Paolilla was found guilty. She was 17 at the time of the murders, which meant she would not face the death penalty. She was, however, sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 40 years to serve. She will be eligible for parole in 2046, when she will be 60 years old. More than 5 years after the murders back in July 2003, the families of the victims said that they felt the guilty verdict would finally allow them to begin moving on with their lives. Christine has filed many appeals since her conviction, but all of them have been denied. Houston Police Sergeant Brian Harris said that he believes that Christine still does not own her part in the crime. For her to truly come to grips with what she has done, she has to acknowledge that there's a darkness in her soul, he said. Christine's stepfather Thomas said, "I'm very sorry for these families and their loss. The guy who did this is dead. He was very, very bad. He was a predator. My daughter is paying for someone else's sins. My daughter doesn't deserve this. My daughter is a victim too. It's hard to know exactly what happened that fateful afternoon and why it did. Police say there were 6 people at the scene. 5 of them are now dead, and 1 of them isn't talking. So with this, it is likely that the full truth will never be fully known." The aftermath of that awful day is still widely felt, with Rachel's father calling it an earthquake for the families and community. Marcus's stepfather said, "Our lives are very different now. We see things differently than before, and we know that we will never again feel the sense of hope that we used to feel." On January 13, 1996, in Arlington, Texas, Amber Hagerman was riding her new pink and white bicycle that she'd just gotten for Christmas. In the parking lot of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store, the 9-year-old Girl Scout was with her 5-year-old little brother, Ricky. They were playing down the road from their grandmother's house, when apparently Ricky remembered they were only supposed to go around the block and headed back home. Amber stayed and continued to play around the parking lot. It was a Saturday, and they were at their grandparents' that day because their mother was being interviewed for a local news special about families that successfully got off welfare and rejoined the workforce. Amber and Ricky left their grandparents' home around 3:10 p.m., with Ricky returning shortly after without his sister. Families soon went looking for Amber, and when they arrived at the parking lot, they saw a handful of police officers surrounding Amber's bike. They were told that someone in the community saw something and that Amber had been abducted. A witness and retired police officer, Jim Cavell, 78 at the time, said he saw Amber riding alone when he saw a black pickup truck and, quote, he pulled up, jumped out and grabbed her. When she screamed, I figured the police ought to know about it, so I called them. Jim gave a description of the abductor. He said that it was a man, Caucasian or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s, shorter than 6 feet, medium build, with dark hair. He was driving a black pickup truck with no markings or chrome and seemed to be in clean working condition. He noted the time of the abduction was 3:18 p.m., and Amber had only been alone for a few minutes. Law enforcement, the FBI, and locals began a massive search for Amber, and her abduction made national news, but despite the nationwide attention, no other witnesses ever came forward to identify the man or the vehicle. For days later, a man was walking his dog when he saw something in a creek. When he looked closer, he found a body lying face down in the water. Police arrived at the scene, and the body was identified as the missing 9-year-old Amber Hegerman. Amber's body was found less than 4 miles from where she was abducted. She was found completely naked except for a sock on her left foot, and her throat had been cut. Police believe that she was washed down the creek as there had been considerable rainfall the night before she was discovered. Police worked hard to find anything on Amber's murder, but there was little evidence. It was later discovered that she had been alive for at least 2 days after her abduction, making police believe that someone might have seen something. Also, due to the circumstances of the abduction, they believe that Amber was targeted and may have been stalked prior to her being taken. Since Amber's death, law enforcement has followed over 7,000 possible leads. There was a laundromat next to the abandoned grocery store where Amber was abducted. Authorities know that this area had many Hispanic people who may have felt uncomfortable talking to police at the time. Police have said in more recent press releases that they do not care about legal status and they just want any information on Amber, and that it might be given anonymously, and urge anyone with information to come forward. They want justice for her family. In a 2021 press conference, it was released after all this time that they did have one piece of evidence with DNA. Police have stated that they would not reveal the evidence as only the killer would know. They had planned to test the evidence through more modern means later that year. Donna Williams, Amber's mother, said, quote, to Amber's killer, I'm asking you today, please turn yourself in. Give Amber justice. Amber needs justice deeply. It has been over 25 years since Amber was murdered. Police have never stopped looking for her killer, and she has had a significant impact not only on Arlington, but across the country. Amber's case was what inspired the Amber Alert system, which was suggested by a local woman, Diane Simone. She wanted to help in search efforts, but didn't know how to best assist. She had an idea to utilize radio station and news broadcasting to amplify missing or abducted children cases, using the existing systems that were used to alert to weather warnings or civil defense alerts. It has been called several names in honor of other missing children in other states, but is now called the Amber Alert system nationally and even internationally, with other countries adopting the system. In the US, the Amber Alert has saved over 1,114 children. On February 28, 1983, 2 men entered an abandoned apartment building on Clemens Avenue in St. Louis, Missouri, scavenging for copper pipe or looking for something to fix their car. That detail is mixed. They looked around the house and then went down to the basement. When they got to the basement, they couldn't see anything, so one of the men lit a cigarette. And when he did, he saw something in the shadows. When the men looked closer, they found a child's body lying on her stomach, and the men called the police. When law enforcement arrived, they found the body of an African-American girl, naked from the waist down, wearing a yellow V-neck long-sleeve sweater. She had been restrained behind the back with a red and white nylon rope. She had red nail polish on all her fingernails. The body had been decapitated, and the head was missing. After the autopsy, the medical examiner determined the girl to be between the ages of 8 and 11. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled before she had been decapitated. She had been well nourished with no signs of previous abuse, but her stomach was empty at the time of death. They took a mold sample of her body in the area and determined the girl had been killed 3 to 5 days before her body was discovered. Authorities and first responders searched a 16-mile radius of the surrounding area in sewers and dumpsters anywhere they could think of, but they never located the skull. Very little blood was found at the scene, so investigators believed that she was killed at another location and dumped at the apartment building. Investigators looked into local and national databases for any missing children fitting Jane Doe's description. They looked into school records for absent children. Within the next 7 months, they claimed to have accounted for every African-American girl between the ages of 8 and 11 enrolled in school. It was then believed that she may have been from a different area. There were never any witnesses, and the police found no other evidence. They never identified little Jane Doe. Her case went cold. Captain Leroy Adkins in a community meeting in 1983 said, quote, "Somebody out there knows something, and talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. Somewhere out there is a mother without a little girl, a brother without a sister, a neighbor without a little girl running up and down the street." 9 months after little Jane Doe was discovered, they gave her a funeral. The people that attended were predominantly detectives, reporters, and Reverend John W. Haywood presided over the service. She was buried in a white coffin in the Washington Park Cemetery in December 1983. Over the years, they have looked into many leads on this case, including sending the sweater to a psychic in Florida who wanted to touch the piece of clothing to see what they could discern from it. But the police never got the sweater back, and the psychic said that the sweater got lost in the mail. They also talked to a convicted murderer on death row in 2005 who had a similar MO, Vernon Brown. He had strangled other young girls in the 1980s, but he did not speak to detectives when interviewed, and his capital sentence went forward in May 2005. In 2009, police tried to exhume the body in hopes of running new tests to help identify the girl. They discovered she was not in the listed location where they went to find her. Instead, they found 3 other bodies. The Washington Park Cemetery had been neglected for years. Finally, with Washington University's help, they exhumed little Jane Doe's body in 2013. Tests were conducted by the Smithsonian Institution and the University of North Texas. They took DNA and bone samples from an isotope test. They were able to determine that she had lived most of her life in a southeastern state. On February 8, 2014, she was reburied following an hour-long ceremony. Many people attended, and she was buried in Cavalry Cemetery in St. Louis. Her grave marker identifies her as Hope. A former detective for the case, Joe Burgun, said, quote, "Back then, I thought this would be an easy case to crack. We'd find out who the girl was and would lead us to the killer." The St. Louis City Cold Case Unit formed in 2019 and has a room dedicated to the case of little Jane Doe. They have never given up hope on identifying her. Jane Doe, 1983, as she is identified on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website, said she is the only case with no photo or facial reconstruction. There's only a picture of the sweater. The St. Louis Police Department is still looking for any information. Little Jane Doe grew up in Southeast United States. She was approximately 4'10" to 5'2", between the ages of 8 and 11. She would have gone missing sometime in 1983. She had no distinctive marks or previous injuries. There are hopes that in identifying her, they will be closer to solving her murder. In January 2018, 19-year-old Caitlin Dennison was living in Reno, Nevada when she abruptly told her family that she was flying to Texas to be with an unknown man. The two had met 6 months prior in Reno, and when he had to fly back to Texas after 6 months, she decided to go with him. On January 10, 2018, Caitlin's sister, Rachel Dennison, received what would be the last time she heard her voice. Caitlin had called from a Walmart in Midland, Texas. On the call to her sister, she said that she wanted to come home and that "this guy makes me scared for my life." She abruptly ended the call. As the man approached, Caitlin sent her sister a pin of her location right after the phone call had ended. No one heard from Caitlin again. Rachel went to the police and reported her sister missing the next day. Law enforcement have said they got positive sightings of Caitlin that day at the Walmart she called from and Rick's Cabaret in Odessa, Texas. Caitlin was last seen wearing a fur vest over a black shirt, black leggings with braiding down the sides of the legs, and furry boots. A witness has come forward saying that they gave her a ride to her boyfriend's house, which was another confirmed sighting of Caitlin. Police have interviewed the unknown man. The information the man gave her that has been released is that Caitlin has been looking for work and had been having a hard time because of her noticeable arm scars. Police have interviewed the unknown man. He has been identified, but that information has been limited on what's been released to the public. The information we have is that he said that Caitlin had been looking for work and been having a hard time because she had noticeable arm scars. One day he came home and she and all of her stuff were just gone. When police went to interview this man again, he was nowhere to be found and has yet to be found. In August 2018, Rachel saw news coverage of a Ring doorbell of a woman in a t-shirt and arm restraints, and she thought it could have been Caitlin as she had the same build and bone structure. However, that woman was later identified and was not Caitlin. In this case, very little information has been released to the public by police or covered in the media. But in 2021, a YouTuber, Kendall Ray, released a video giving some more light on the case, causing a new detective to reopen the investigation. Midland Police Detective Jenny Alonzo said, quote, "The case came back to light in November of 2021 because a YouTuber had put her case online, and so it came back to our knowledge that she was still missing. I took on this case, and I believe that there are other avenues of approach that we didn't do back in 2018 that we could do more follow-ups on." In a statement to the media, Rachel Dennison said, quote, "I am just really thankful we are finally able to communicate with someone who wants to listen to us and keep us in the loop and do everything they can and are still willing to retrace steps that we thought were missed. It has been almost 5 years since Caitlin went missing." Her sister Rachel has never stopped the fight to look for her sister, and they have an active Facebook page called Find Caitlin Dennison and a GoFundMe in the hopes of getting a private investigator and flights to go down to Texas. Police have given very little information to the family about what has been done to look for her. To this day, they still don't know the name of the man that she went to meet. Caitlin Dennison would be 23 years old today. At the time of her disappearance, she was 5'4", 120 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She has an alien head, an M tattoo on her left knuckle, a Libra scale tattoo on her right arm, 2 piercings on her nose on both sides, a bottom lip piercing, a tongue piercing, and a Medusa piercing. She also has scars on her arms and legs. Caitlin's family and Texas Rangers have been working to find answers to her disappearance and are asking for the public's help. If you may have seen Caitlin or know of her whereabouts or who she may have been with, please contact law enforcement. Harvey Eugene Whitaker, who went by Gene, was born in Kokomo, Indiana on October 6, 1926. He was a very responsible and disciplined young man. He grew up on a farm with numerous siblings with whom he was close and worked as a typesetter for the local newspaper. He joined the Army shortly after he graduated high school. He managed to rise to the rank of corporal in under 2 years. In the summer of 1947, 20-year-old Gene was in the Engineer Corps, assigned to the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project at the top-secret Sandia base, which was located on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Gene failed to report for roll call on the morning of July 1, 1947. This immediately signaled trouble to his superiors as Gene was a dependable soldier who they could not imagine abandoning his duties. Gene did not smoke or drink and had never gone absent without leave before. The previous evening, Gene had been at a bowling alley in Albuquerque with an Army bowling league. He was an above-average bowler, and because he was so trustworthy, he was made the treasurer of the league. 2 days after Gene went missing, his glasses, shirt, hat, and necktie were found in an alley near the bowling alley. The shirt was bloody. Tears in the fabric indicated that Gene may have been stabbed twice in the back while he was still wearing the shirt. While some of his belongings had been found, there was still no sign of Gene himself or of his body. It was estimated that Gene had between $4,500 with him the night he vanished because of his role as the treasurer of the bowling league. However, the fact that Gene's body was not left behind even if he had been killed during a simple robbery and his position within the military led to concerns that his disappearance may have had national implications. The Armed Forces Special Weapons Project had taken over atomic weapons development from the Manhattan Project following World War II. Sandia was a top-secret base, meaning Jean potentially had access to important and sensitive information. This led to fears that Jean had been abducted by someone who was hoping to extract top-secret information about the base or its projects from him. Jean reportedly had done work connected to the top-secret guided missile program. Spy activities had recently been discovered at the nearby base at Los Alamos. As such, the FBI joined local and military authorities in investigating the disappearance. The War Department ultimately dismissed the possibility that Jean had information worth killing for, but the FBI remained actively investigating the case for several more years. Investigators also considered the possibility that Jean had deserted. They questioned his family members and tapped their phones, hoping to find evidence of Jean contacting them. The last piece of correspondence between Jean and anyone in his family was a letter he sent to his Rose, but it was dated June 23rd, a week before he disappeared. Jean's bank account in Indiana was monitored but never touched. Jean was declared legally dead in January of 1954. Many, but not all of his January of 1954. Many, but not all of his relatives, accepted the theory that he had been murdered during a robbery. His niece, Patty Mawson, however, believes that the circumstances surrounding her uncle's disappearance are highly suspicious and continues to work on his case to this day. She is upset that all of Jean's siblings died without knowing what happened to him and by the fact that he is still technically considered AWOL and a deserter by the Army. She has filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get files from the FBI about the case and told that approximately 200 pages from his file are available, although the copies she will receive will have certain information redacted. However, she has been waiting for more than 3 years to receive the documents and has been told that there are 485 requests ahead of hers that have to be fulfilled first. The items of Jean's that were found in the alley also appear to have gone missing. They were never logged into evidence with police in Albuquerque, and federal agencies do not appear to have record of where they are. In addition to getting answers about what happened to her uncle, Patty hopes to locate these items. If she cannot honor her uncle by finding his remains and giving him a proper burial, she hopes to at least bury these items so that there will be a location where Jean can be memorialized. 17-year-old Yvonne Regler lived in Lorain, Ohio, and was a student at North Olmsted High School. Her best friend was her brother, Dan, who was only a year apart from her in age. On August 8, 1977, Yvonne reported for work at the Sunoco gas station on Lorain Road in North Olmsted, Ohio. She was only at the station for about an hour before she was asked to work instead at a station approximately 3 miles away in Fairview Park. The attendant working there that morning was a mechanic, and his skills were needed at the North Olmsted station. Yvonne did not have a car, so one of her co-workers drove her to the other station. At the time, the station in Fairview Park was transitioning from being full service to self-service. On this particular day, only one gas pump was operational and was full service. At 10:30 that morning, Yvonne spoke to one of her friends on the phone. They discussed the upcoming funeral they were attending for the father of one of their friends and the dress Yvonne had purchased for the service. Despite the somber topic of conversation, the friend reported that Yvonne was in good spirits during this call. Yvonne then had another conversation over the phone about the funeral, this time with one of her family members at 11 a.m. The manager at the North Olmsted station dropped off lunch for Yvonne at noon, and half an hour later, 2 teenage girls saw her at the gas station. Yvonne spoke to her friend on the phone again sometime between 12:30 and 1 p.m. The friend could hear the service building over the line, and Yvonne told them that a car had driven through but left the station. The friend heard the bell sound again, and Yvonne told them that the same car was back. Yvonne then said that she would call the friend again after her shift ended at 3 o'clock. Yvonne initialed the receipt when a customer used a credit card to buy gas at 1:25 p.m. Between 1:30 and 2:05, 3 people, 2 customers and a coffee machine repairman, came into the station and found no one there. They were not alarmed, however, and did not contact police. The employee who came to take over for Yvonne when her shift ended was alarmed, however, when he arrived at 2:45. Yvonne was nowhere to be found, but her purse, partially eaten lunch, cigarettes, and book were still there. He called over to the North Olmsted station, and the manager, who had seen Yvonne less than 3 hours earlier, rushed over to help look for her. When he and the other employee could not find her, they called police at 3:30. There were no signs of a struggle inside the station, and there was still $300 in cash in the register. Police theorized that Yvonne had been abducted while she was outside, potentially when she had gone out to pump a customer's gas. More than 100 tips were investigated in the following years. Local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies were involved in the investigation. Numerous persons of interest were identified, but without finding Yvonne or her body, police could only theorize about what had potentially been done to her. Years and then decades passed without any answers in the case. The passage of time did not diminish Yvonne's family's desire for answers. In 2014, one of her family members asked to provide a DNA sample so that Yvonne's remains could be identified should they ever be located. This led to a renewed effort by authorities in the investigation. Police went back and re-interviewed all of the witnesses in the case. In 2016, on the 39th anniversary of Yvonne's disappearance, the Fairview Park Police Department announced that during this process, they had identified a potential person of interest in the case. This man was known to police and had previously been connected to crimes of a similar nature to Yvonne's case. Police made this news public in hopes of encouraging new witnesses to come forward with tips that could potentially help them confirm or refute this individual's involvement in Yvonne's disappearance. The effort did not result in the case being solved. In 2021, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image of what Yvonne may look like at the age of 62. Everyone is doing what they need to be doing on the police side. On my side, all I can do is hope that there will be closure, Yvonne's brother Dan said in 2022. 29-year-old Vita Lou Powers was a dependable employee of St. Thomas West Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and the dedicated mother of 2 children. She was very close with her family and was always willing to help them. Ida began May 26, 1982 as normal, sticking to her usual routine. She left her home on 9th Avenue South and dropped her children off at daycare. She then drove over to her sister's house to pick her up and give her a ride to her job at the Continental Insurance office. It was at this point in the morning where Vita began deviating from her routine. During the drive to the insurance office, Vita told her sister that she had taken the day off from work, so instead of driving to the hospital after dropping her off, she would be going home and going back to bed. Vita's sister would be the last known person to see her. Vita did not pick up her children from daycare that afternoon, which was unheard of for her. Her family was notified and the search for her quickly began. She was not at home and neither was her car, an orange 1975 Chevrolet Monza. A formal police report was taken on May 28th and police joined the search. Vito's car was located on May 30th, abandoned on 14th Street South near Edgehill Avenue, just a few blocks away from her home. According to police, the location was unusual and it appeared that someone had tried to conceal the car so that it would not be found right away. Vita's purse and eyeglasses were found inside the vehicle. This was concerning because Vita had very poor eyesight and relied heavily on her glasses. The glasses being left behind led police to believe that foul play was involved in Vita's disappearance. Police do have a person of interest in the case, but not enough evidence to conclusively tie him to Vita's appearance. The month of May continues to be difficult for Vita's 2 children because it marks the anniversary of her disappearance as well as her birthday and Mother's Day. Vita's daughter Yolanda, who was just 9 years old when her mother went missing, continues to search for her mother and hopes that anyone who knew her mother at the time she vanished or as even the smallest piece of information will come forward. I'm just keeping it positive. Every day, the Lord wakes me up, is a day for me to try and find her, Yolanda said in 2023. Jason Knapp was a native of York, Pennsylvania. He was hardworking and smart. He was also a perfectionist from a young age, once crying for 3 days because he got a bad grade on a test in elementary school. As he got older, his commitment to excellence quickly paid off. He played 3 sports in high school and had lots of friends, to whom he was very loyal. He was accepted into the mechanical engineering program at Clemson University in South Carolina. He was a member of the ROTC. And in 1998, 20-year-old Jason was pledged into the National Society of Pershing Rifles, a National Military Honor Society. His hobbies also required a great amount of skill as he enjoyed target shooting and mountain biking. Jason normally called back home to speak to his mother, Deborah, in Pennsylvania every day. During their call on Saturday, April 11, 1998, he told her about his induction into the Pershing Rifles and how he and a friend had been out looking for an apartment. This would be the last time Deborah spoke to her son. Deborah did not get any calls from her son in the next few days, which was unusual, but she assumed he was busy studying in preparation for the end of the semester and making arrangements for his housing in the following school year. On April 17th, Deborah finally received a phone call, but it was not from Jason. It was from one of his roommates informing her that no one had seen Jason all week. The last time anyone had seen Jason was the day he last spoke to his mother, Saturday, April 11th. That evening, his roommate had seen him watching a movie in their apartment. When Deborah learned of this, she immediately called police in South Carolina to report her son missing. Police officers checked local hospitals and searched Jason's apartment. The following day, Deborah and her ex-husband, Jason's father, John, traveled from Pennsylvania to South Carolina to help look for their son. On April 21st, Jason's white 1990 Chevrolet Beretta was reported to police as being parked at Table Rock State Park in Pickens, South Carolina, approximately 30 miles away from his college campus. According to the park superintendent, they had not contacted the police earlier despite the fact that the car had been there since April 12th because there was a trail within the park that took a full week to complete. Since there was a sticker on Jason's car indicating that he was an ROTC, park staff had assumed he would have had interest in hiking such a long trail and the physical strength and skills needed to complete it. Even when the car remained untouched after a week, they believed that its owner may have been too tired to drive after completing the long hike and had gotten a ride home and planned to come back for the car at a later time. When the car was still there on the 9th day, however, they became concerned and notified the authorities, who quickly connected the car to the active missing persons case. Authorities believe Jason entered the park between 3:05 p.m. on Sunday, April 12th, the day after his last phone conversation with his mother. His fingerprints were found on the park ticket, so they do believe Jason was the person who drove his car to the location. Table Rock State Park consists of thousands of acres and much of it is wilderness. An extensive search was launched in the park and a nearby lake was drained. No signs of Jason were found despite the massive effort, which took more than 2 weeks. Police say there were no signs of foul play in the park or in Jason's car. Jason withdrew $20 from his bank account the day before he disappeared, and his bank account has not been touched since. In 2017, Jason's parents made the difficult decision to have Jason declared legally dead. His father John's health was declining, and his mother had medical issues as well. They hoped that the process would give them a chance to say goodbye to Jason before they passed away. The process was completed in January of 2018. A memorial marker was installed for Jason at Susquehanna Memorial Garden in his hometown. Jason's father, John, passed away in 2019. Even 25 years after his disappearance, investigative efforts to find Jason are ongoing. In 2022, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new image of what Jason may look like today. Jason's mother, Deborah, had a bench installed in Jason's name at the Botanical Gardens at Clemson. She travels there yearly to remember her son and write him a letter as part of her efforts to cope with his disappearance. She still hopes she will find answers about what became of her son within her lifetime. Pamela Halapainen grew up in the South Porcupine neighborhood of Timmins, a mining town in northern Ontario. Her mother, Holly Kautuk, was Inuit and her family was originally from Nunavut. Like many Indigenous individuals in Canada, Holly was sent to a boarding school. She arrived at the school at the age of 14, and a year later, she became pregnant with Pamela's older sister, Vanessa Brousseau. Pamela was born 2 years after Vanessa. Holly did her best to actively raise her daughters in their Inuit culture and teach them to embrace their heritage in their daily lives as much as possible. Since there were no other Inuit and Timmins, she was active in the local indigenous community, the Cree. Holly would eventually become the president of the Timmins Native Friendship Center. Pamela and Vanessa were very close growing up and relied heavily on one another. They grew up in poverty and therefore had very few toys. So they used their imaginations to make up games and activities together. Pamela was outgoing and outspoken. She had a big personality, which was also reflected in how deeply she cared for others and the great lengths she would go to help anyone who needed anything. Pamela left school prior to graduating high school so she could go to work. Following a brief stint as a waitress, she found a job in a call center where she excelled. By 2003, 22-year-old Pamela had a common-law spouse with whom she had 2 sons. She was a devoted mother. Pamela and Vanessa remained close as adults, and it was common for them to speak multiple times a day. On December 13, 2003, Pamela asked Vanessa if she could babysit her 2 boys that night. Vanessa was unable to, so Pamela made other arrangements. Vanessa went to Pamela's house on December 15th, but no one was home. She continued visiting the house over the next few days to see her sister and drop off Christmas presents for her nephews, but no one was ever at the house. Vanessa assumed that they had gone to spend Christmas with Pamela's common-law spouse's family. Pamela did not call Vanessa on Christmas Day, which Vanessa was very upset about. On December 26th, Vanessa was able to speak with Pamela's landlord. They had not seen the family either. At this point, Vanessa was still under the assumption that her sister was with her common-law spouse's family and simply failing to call her. Vanessa learned that she was wrong on New Year's Eve. That day, Vanessa and her mother were at a bingo hall when a woman came up to them and asked if they had heard about Pamela. They said they did not, and the woman told them that Pamela had left her common-law spouse. Vanessa and Holly then asked where Pamela's children were. They were still with their father. This was an immediate indication that something was not right to Vanessa and Holly. It was conceivable that Pamela would leave her spouse. There was not even a remote possibility, however, that Pamela would go anywhere without her sons. Vanessa and Holly went to police to report Pamela missing. While they made the report as soon as they realized that something was wrong, it had been more than 2 weeks since anyone had seen Pamela. She had attended a house party on the evening of December 13th and had left it in the early morning hours of 14th after reportedly getting into an argument with her common-law spouse and saying she would walk home. Police were not concerned about Pamela's disappearance, telling Vanessa and Holly that Pamela was probably out drinking and would reappear in a few days, a conclusion with no supporting evidence. Vanessa and Holly, understandably frustrated by this disregard for Pamela's well-being, began their own search, organizing friends and family members to create and distribute flyers and to search for Pamela. For months after Pamela went missing, when police finally began investigating Pamela's disappearance, they told her family that they believed Pamela was a sex worker in Hamilton, Ontario. They supported this claim with 2 nude pictures Pamela had taken of herself, presumably for her common-law spouse, that had been found on her personal computer. The case was eventually taken over by the Ontario Provincial Police, but the investigator assigned to the case faced allegations of attempted murder and arson. 2013. The case was sent back to police in Timmins, who told Pamela's sister Vanessa that the case was not active. Pamela's mother, Holly, passed away on December 31st, 2007, exactly 4 years to the day after she reported her daughter missing to police. Vanessa Brusso continues to advocate and search for her sister. She is active on social media, sharing her sister's story as well as stories of the challenges facing Indigenous people in Canada. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.